Good afternoon all, in a series of discussions about economic policy post the COVID crisis. I must admit, looking at the emerging data of infections, though, I guess we need to recalibrate our language, probably something a little less like post the COVID crisis and more like learning to live with the COVID crisis. Anyway, a very great deep thanks to all of you for joining us this afternoon, especially the discussants and panelists that you see on the screen in front of you. This series has been done in partnership with IFPRI, the International Food Policy Research Institute, and with funding by the German Development Corporation, GIZ. This session follows on three others that have looked into monetary, labor, and trade policy in the South African economy, especially in light of emerging factors around the COVID crisis. And all of these sessions are available for your reference through the URSA's YouTube channel. Relevant documentation as well as podcasts are also available on URSA's and IFPRI's websites. Today, we're discussing building back for a sustainable future. Contextualizing the discussions, we have two papers. The first is on building a competitive and dynamic green industrial sector in South Africa by Tendai Gwatidzo and witness Simbanegavi. The second is on building back fairer from the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa, some first steps in an era of fiscal constraints. The authors of that paper were Channing Arndt, Robert Davies, Sherwin Gabriel, Laurence Harris, Michael Sachs, and Dirk from Seventer. We're very pleased to have two of the authors with us, Tendai, an associate professor at WITS, and Channing from IFPRI as part of our panel today. We are waiting for Anne Bernstein to join us. She is just, there was a problem with the link that we sent her, so we're just sorting that out. But we are joined by Anne Bernstein from the Center for Development and Enterprise and Wandile Sihlobo from the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. All of the participants have a deep and extensive experience in South Africa and working with economic policy. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the series, the format for the discussions is deliberately unstructured. I don't know where this conversation should go, but I'm excited to find out where our panel of discussants leads us. As the audience, we welcome and we value your participation, so please use the Q&A feature as much as you like. In fact, the more the merrier, and I will do my best to fold your questions or observations into the discussion. We will start with an overview of the issues, taking the form mainly of overviews of the two papers from Tendai and then Channing, and that's by way of contextualization. I will then open up a conversation amongst the panel, and towards the end of our session, I will give each discussant a few minutes to make some final comments. So with that said and done, Tendai, can I hand over to you to overview your paper, and we'll then hand over to Channing to do the same, and then we will hopefully by that stage have Anne and Wandile can weigh in on their thoughts, their initial thoughts about the discussion arising out of the paper.
Thanks, Matthew. Let me share my presentation. All right. Thanks, colleagues. Thanks, Matthew, for the introduction. So this particular paper was prepared by Witness and myself. Witness is at the Reserve Bank. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us. He will probably join us later if it's possible. Yeah. So our paper is basically an attempt to look at green industrialization and how, as we look at recovering from COVID, and how possibly South Africa can begin to rebuild, perhaps smarter than we were doing before. So I think Matthew has already mentioned that we are still grappling with COVID, and perhaps the best way is to learn to live with it rather than to think that it will come to an end soon. Indeed, the pandemic serves as a very big reminder of the effects, huge effects of natural disasters. In South Africa, like in other economy, there were large negative effects that emanated from the lockdowns that were instituted to try to mitigate the spread of the virus, including firm closures, job losses, your GDP contraction, etc. So indeed, when you look at the impact of COVID, one can really agree with me that indeed it had such a significant impact on the economy itself. But perhaps the climate change could actually have more devastating effects on the economy as well. There are perhaps some similarities between the two, the COVID and climate change, in the sense that there is a huge downside risk, but there are also a number of differences. If you, for example, look at the fact that the impact of COVID is quite immediate, it's quite sharp, but there is also a possibility that economies may witness rapid recovery from COVID. But when we look at climate change, its effect could be persistent, long-term, and perhaps even more difficult to mitigate and recover from. So if you want, you could actually think that perhaps climate change is here to stay. COVID, perhaps it's something that we may recover from soon, although there are others that argue that perhaps what we may have learned from this particular pandemic is that there are possibly going to be more frequent disasters or pandemics like COVID that we may have to deal with in future. But we can also learn a number of things from COVID. One thing that we can learn perhaps is that it may present us with an opportunity to rebuild better and smarter, taking into account the impact that our production or our consumption has on the environment. So with that in mind, our objective really is to explore some of the challenges and opportunities of greening the South African industrial sector after COVID. We will consider some key initiatives and some progress to date, focusing especially on the manufacturing sector. We will conclude by looking at how green industrialization can actually be leveraged to engender competitiveness. So I think we agree that green industrialization is important for any given economy, South Africa included. So by green industrialization, we are basically talking about reducing carbon content of the industrial output. So of course, South Africa, like any other developing economy, is confronted by some negative environmental factors like your environmental change, environmental degradation, and resource depletion. But complicating South Africa's scenario is that its industrial sector, which is a huge emitter, is actually built around the so-called minerals energy complex, which made it one of the major carbon emitters in the world. So why does it matter? Why does green industrialization matter for an economy like South Africa, for example, right? So there are healthy considerations that needs to be taken into account, because we know that high concentration of greenhouse gas emissions are associated with a number of bad health outcomes. Of course, South Africa also ratified the Paris Agreement. So it's now perhaps an obligation to deliver on its promises. Greening also has some implications when it comes to competitiveness. We now know that there are consumers that are becoming more conscious when it comes to the damage that the environment that may happen to the environment as we produce goods. So South Africa, because it produces goods for local consumption, but also export some of these goods, it must begin to take into account these consumers that are quite conscious when it comes to the carbon content of the goods that it may produce. Another important fact is also the fact that South Africa, if it doesn't take into account the carbon content of its output, may be penalized in international trade. All right, there are some taxes that may be directed at non-performers, and South Africa needs to consider this as it begins to consider rebuilding post-COVID. If we look at the profile of the energy sources for South Africa, the first thing, of course, is to note that it's a major polluter, probably ranked 14th in the world in terms of the total greenhouse gas emissions. One reason, of course, is that it uses coal as a dominant source of energy. So it accounts for 86%. Of about 86% of total electricity generated coming from coal. So that's quite a huge contribution there. And we know that production from coal is associated with high gas emissions. When we look at the policies that are in place, and even perhaps the legal environment that's in place, one can actually see that on paper, there is a huge reflection that South Africa is quite serious when it comes to lowering carbon emissions. So on paper, quite impressive, but then the question could actually be how effective are these legal instruments and the policies that we see. For example, these are some of the policies that are on paper, some of the legislation that's on paper as well, that really is geared towards supporting the transition to a low carbon economy. Of course, the question would be, do we have policy coherence? Do we have any effectiveness when it comes to these policies that are in place? So I'm just going to briefly look at some of the different environmental indicators that we have. For example, on the left panel there, we can see that renewables account for a very small proportion of total electricity generated in South Africa. Between 1990 and 2012, it's accounted for about 2%, a significant jump post-2014, but even then accounting for just about 7%. So renewables account for a very small proportion of total electricity generated. If we further unpack that a bit, looking at what we have on the right panel there, you can see that, well, hydro is quite steady over time, but 2013 going forward, you can see a huge increase in other sources like your wind, your solar, and your solar thermal, your etc., right? You can see some increased role there being played by these other renewables as well. Perhaps another important indicator or picture to look at is the extent to which one can decouple GDP from, say, resource use. You can see, for example, in the left panel there that there is a high correlation between GDP and CO2 emissions. Although this doesn't really give us a causal picture, one can actually see that perhaps we have to emit in order to produce. But you can see the high correlation there seems to indicate that decoupling quite difficult, but beginning to happen post 2008, 2009 there. If you look at the second figure, you can also see that although in the early 90s, the industry energy intensity was quite high or increasing, post 2010, we began to 2002. Sorry, we began to see quite some reduction in energy intensity. One could ask, is this enough? Is this good enough? For example, right? So those are some of the questions that we can begin to ask even when we see the gradual decline in energy intensity at both industry level and economy-wide. So one reason that one could perhaps suggest that that may contribute, for example, to the inefficient use of electricity in terms of households or industries, or even as another low incentive when it comes to investment in green industrialization, could be due to the low prices that were witnessed prior to 2008 when it comes to electricity. So this figure here shows that over a long period of time, for example, the price of electricity in South Africa, one could say, was too low, perhaps for quite a long period of time, encouraging energy-intensive investment and inefficient electricity consumption. But you can see, for example, that post-2008 crisis, there was the ESCOM tariffs were now outstripping the inflation, the inflation rate. Perhaps that could begin to incentivize efficient electricity consumption, or even better investment in projects that have low carbon content. So as the country tries again to shift from high carbon content production to more efficient or environmentally friendly production approaches, what are some of the challenges that we see as the government or the country itself begins to go towards green industrialization? What are some of the challenges that that the economy faces, right? There are a number of these challenges, whether it's related to low skills, whether it's related to the financing by the financial system itself, the technology, institutional arrangements, or even the political economy itself, right? The move towards green industrialization, or in South Africa, largely moving from coal to other renewables, is compounded by a number of factors, including, for example, high levels of unemployment, poverty, inequality, very powerful trade unions that are afraid that such a move, if it's done aggressively, may perhaps result in job losses. Another complication is an inefficient state-owned electricity company, which has, of course, vast market power. So those are some of the complications that the country faces as it begins to transition towards green industrialization. So these different challenges also can explain the reluctance by the policymakers or the government to aggressively force transition towards green industrialization. Instead, perhaps preferring a more gradual approach to decarbonization. Another challenge is around policy incoherence, for example, across government departments, even across sectors as well. Hence, we see, for example, when the government is pronouncing, or when you look at the policies or even the legal framework, that there is that great desire to go towards green industrialization, but at the same time, you see mega projects like your Medupi, your Kusile, etc. So there is that contradiction that on paper, we see the government desiring to go towards green industrialization, but at the same time, you see high carbon content projects like Medupi, Kusile, for example, also being put in place. The financial system itself also perhaps not sufficiently supportive of risky green technology investment. We are beginning to see though banks, for example, stating that they are reluctant to, for example, finance new core projects, for example. But we do also have some opportunities. For example,
Tendai, just can I interrupt you? If we can wrap this up quite quickly, please, that'd be appreciated.
Right. Thanks, Matthew. Just this slide. So, for example, there are a number of opportunities. One of them is the fact that a large number of some of the core plants are actually reaching their decommissioning state. So perhaps these will need to be replaced with renewable energy. The shortage of electricity itself, although it's a challenge, it may also present some opportunities in the sense that perhaps in an attempt to increase supply of electricity, we will begin to see more and more renewables coming in as well. South Africa is well positioned in Africa to participate, for example, in the production of green goods that may be used as inputs as more and more countries actually move towards green industrialization. So I will stop at this point, Matthew, and then I can perhaps listen to questions from the colleagues.
Thanks very much, Tendai. And while Channing loads his presentation, let me abuse my position to just table two thoughts that came to mind for us to think about as we talk forward. The first is, I think the paper does a great job of explaining the fallacy between the competition between economic growth and sustainability. Practically, there are very complicated short-term costs and long-term benefits that are colliding. And how do we kind of resolve, how do we make that a real compatibility, the compatibility between sustainability and development, when you have comments by politicians, and they're meaningful comments, along the lines of, we support a low carbon economy so long as it doesn't harm economic growth. How do we begin to get past that idea of a competition between economic growth and sustainability? It's not a question directly to you, Tendai, it's just a thought for the panel. The second thing is, for good reason, a green industrial policy looks a lot like an energy supply policy. It looks a lot like introducing renewables and other less carbon intensive sources of electricity generation. Is it true that it is so heavily skewed in that direction? Or are there other important things within the industrial policy landscape that might matter? Channing, are you loading up your screen?
Tendai, you need to stop sharing your screen and then I can share mine.
Oh, sorry, Chan. Okay. Let me see. Oh.
There we go.
There you go.
Okay, are we seeing it?
All good, Channing.
All right, let me put this into presentation mode. There we go. So should I take off, Matthew?
Go ahead.
Great, thank you. So thank you for having me here today, talking about building back fair from the COVID-19 pandemic. Some first steps in an era of fiscal constraints. As Matthew mentioned, many co-authors. So here we go. Just a little bit of context that's well known, but you know, even pre-crisis, prior to the pandemic, take the fourth quarter of 2019, you know, economic growth was near zero and certainly below zero on a per capita basis, and had basically been trending downwards. This is the real growth line that you see between 94 and 2019. So it's not a new growth crisis that has come along. And you know, if you go back to August 2019, this was well recognized. We have the National Treasury's growth strategy, the so-called 77-pager, the Tito Mboweni, the finance minister at the time, saying we're facing a slow burn economic crisis. And today, with COVID having come in about 6 months later, you sort of a less favorable situation in every measurable dimension. With fiscal constraints, there was a fair amount of spending correctly to keep the economy afloat during the pandemic, but this has worsened the debt situation. So we do have fiscal constraints likely to be pronounced in the near term. And we can see that here. This was pulled together inside the paper. And you could see that government consumption, which is sort of the budget consolidated red line in nominal terms, lower than the projected CPI. I think that obviously this was done a few months ago and could be updated, but broadly the conclusion is there's not a lot of space for fiscal expansion, so it's not likely to be durable. So this then brings us to, okay, how do we get out? There's a lot of discussion, and we'll bring it to some about structural constraints, and certainly we want to address structural constraints. But there are also a variety of things that can be done in policy reform. And addressing structural constraints, we want to do that, but it's going to take a while to take care of structural constraints. One that we be thinking about here is the skills constraint, and certainly the way to take care of the skills constraint in the long run is to have effective universities, which you have, and gradually more effective primary and secondary school system, grade school system, and that also appears to be coming on along the way. But this is going to take a lot of time. So what can be done in the nearer term to move in a variety of domains? And the paper goes into 3 areas of focus: skills, which relates to the educational system, food systems, nutrition and health, and urban structure, all of which face structural constraints, but also have some policy possibilities or focuses that could be taken on. These are not new areas, they're broadly in line with what the 77 pager, but we're adding some detail and discussion around those. I underline skills because in order to keep to time, I'm just going to focus on those, and then we can get to the discussion. Wandili perhaps want to talk about food system, nutrition, and health, and we're happy to do that. But just in terms of the presentation, we'll focus on the skills side. So obviously, in the long run, like I mentioned, we want to enhance the educational system. It's structural. In the short run, policy that allows for immigration of highly skilled people to join firms is something that could alleviate this constraint of highly skilled people. So first, I'm going to try to point out the evidence of South Africa as an economy that is powerfully skilled constrained. And there's a series of things. This is work that we didn't do, but we can cite. So the panel on the left there is from Branson and Librand. It goes back to 2012, and it's showing the ratio of wages by education level to those of primary education or less. But so basically, this line up top here is tertiary educated labor their wage relative to essentially the unskilled wage, going from 1994 to 2010. And it's important to point out that, in the immediate post-apartheid period, post-1994, the notion was that this was a relatively high number, that this ratio, around 5.5 or 6, was pretty high. And what's striking is it rises, and it rises by a lot. I mean, in the United States, this ratio went up by 10%, and people are saying, oh, that's or less, that's a big rise. This went up by 50% or more between 1994 and 2010. So the opening of the South African economy and the drivers in terms of government expanding and bringing in people had big effects in terms of, or this trend is clearly present. It continues. A second source, this is Wittenberg. So this is just wages at percentile. So this is the ratio of the 90th percentile to the median. And we see almost exactly the same story extending out through to the fourth quarter of 2012, and almost exactly the same ratio, more than about a 50% or more rise in the ratio. So, and this is the big driver of continuing inequality in South Africa. That's been shown. More recently, we have Bastian Willard, who produced a paper in 2020. And on the left here, this is sort of income or total household income drawn from the tax data, drawn from SARS, essentially. And it's a subset of the very top level tax returns from 95th to the 100th percentile. Actually, a few of these are excluded at the very, very top level, but this is the big earners in South Africa. And you can see that their annual growth, income growth, real, is much, much higher than the economy generally. So this trend towards upper income people doing better is continuing. And the right one shows you that it's wages still. So all of these orange bars, that's salary. Then other parts, bonus, commission, director, these are also all considered wage income. So wage income is a huge share, even until you get to the 99.9th percentile of earners, right? So once you get to the very, very top, a handful of people are earning mainly out of capital, but most people who are putting in tax returns are claiming income via wages. So wages, this is a big deal. We're seeing it, and basically, we're just taking the economic intuition here. If the price is going up, this means that demand is outstripping supply. It's almost as simple as that. So there's strong evidence for these constraints, and they continue all the way up until the very most recent data that we have, which I believe Ingrid goes through 2015, 16, something like that. So here we run a simulation using the South African General Equilibrium model, a version of the model that the Treasury also uses. And all we're doing is a very simple simulation here where we're increasing the supply of high earners, or the stock of highly skilled and experienced workers, by about 1%. So we figure this is around 11,000 high earners, earning more, 3 times actually, than the average for tertiary earners. And what we get, we let everything else loose. So the skills constraint is the binding constraint on the economy. You can get more employment, you can get more capital, and that's shown at the top here, and you do. And then GDP terms, so 1% brings you about a 1.21% increase in GDP overall. Taxes rise, and it's trade intensive. So it's pushing towards exports, sort of along the lines of what Tendai was talking about, that, you know, skills being a pretty big component of the South African export basket. So it's pushing in that direction as well. And these are, you know, very, very strong impacts for, you know, a policy is looking at, you know, something like 30 people arriving per day in Johannesburg and going to work, but high earners driving quite a lot of growth. So these are the observations, you know, increased growth, employment, revenue, exports. You're also getting reduced inequality. You're going to get that for two effects. First, mainly as you bring in greater employment of unskilled and semi-skilled labor, that's going to improve the inequality reading. But at the same time, you are exposing highly skilled South Africans to the, you know, the full force of international competition. You don't expect unemployment to occur because unemployment basically doesn't occur amongst highly skilled and experienced people anywhere, including in South Africa. But you would expect mildly lower wages and more competition. So there is that fact. This is not a new idea. There have been people, Houseman and others, pushing this since at least 2008. Internationally, it's certainly done. United States, Canada, Denmark, many other countries have policies to bring in skilled migration. And, you know, it's been a part of South Africa's, potential part of South Africa's growth strategy as well, mentioned in the 77-pager. There are important links to Black economic empowerment here, and there are two. The first just relates to the rules. And it's a potential that if you're trying to bring in highly skilled people, you may loosen the border restrictions, but if you don't look at what's going on with BEE regulations, then you may not be able to bring in anybody anyway. So that's just something that needs to be looked at. I think there is also a very positive aspect to BEE here. We are seeing an increase in unemployment amongst recent graduates with tertiary degrees. And this is a big inefficiency. The society has invested a lot in recent graduates. But it's also, you know, there's been a great big effort and very successful to bring previously disadvantaged groups through the university system. And what these people need are you know, bosses and mentors. You know, no company in the world takes on a very complicated project such as these kinds of industrialization projects that Tendai was talking about, or energy projects, with just college graduates or, you know, recent university graduates. That doesn't happen. You have to mix them with skilled people in order to get them to be productive, tell them what to do to grow their careers. And that's something, along with the growth, that's missing. So I think that there is a very positive perspective to the economic empowerment dimension here, going into some of the best jobs on the planet. So this is all, like I said, something that can be done with changes to words on pieces of paper rather than massive investments or new revenues or things, and it can come in fairly fast. So the other points actually aren't quite as quick as this, but are quicker. But I will stop here in order to allow for the conversation to take off. So that's what I wanted to bring up. Thanks a lot, Matthew. I look forward to hearing the comments of the discussants and the questions from the audience.
Thank you very much, Channing. And yeah, both of you, those are both excellent and I think very important papers for where we find ourselves. Certainly have been written in a way that is accessible to an informed audience. So that's I think very valuable too. And I'm going to hand over to you, but while you prepare, and then I'll hand over to Andile. While you do that, while you get yourself organized, I'm going to again just abuse my position and table two things that I found interesting in the paper from Channing. Channing, the first, or to the group of you, the first is this idea of switching drivers of demand and investment from a government-led investment strategy to a private sector-led investment strategy, given the state of the public finances, but also the implementation capacity of the country. And the second was this, I haven't seen it before, as prominently explained, this interest in small-scale agriculture. So those are two things that I found quite interesting about it. Anne, over to you. Comments and observations for the authors. Please feel free to ask them direct questions.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Matthew. It's good to be here. And thanks to Tendai and Channing for two interesting papers. I'm a lot more knowledgeable about what Channing was talking about than Tendai. I would just make two comments in terms of how Tendai presented his paper. The first is that I think the amount of money the private sector mobilized very quickly and put into renewable energy in the first round of the REIPPs was much more significant than you allow for. And that's really important. Of course, all the benefit of that and the capacity that was built up has now declined because of the long delays. But I think that that's an important thing to put into your thinking. The second is, I think it's really important in South Africa that we all are cognizant of our weak, declining state. So it's very difficult to, and I'm guilty of that as much as anyone else. You know, we like to talk about the government as though we had a normal kind of cabinet with everybody or the vast majority of people working hard and dedicated to the national interest. I don't think that is the case. It certainly wasn't the case in the Zuma years, and I'm not sure it's improved very much at all. So with a few exceptions, it's hard to talk about the government. And I think we need to think very hard about what that means for policy. Let me move on to the skills issue, because I know a lot more about that. And we've been calling for this since long before 2008. So I'm delighted to see this research, Channing, especially the link between wage inequality and an expansion of foreign skills. I think there are a number of issues that need to be thought about and reflected on. The first is what one means by highly skilled. We've been saying we think the line should be much lower than that. I don't know what you mean by highly skilled, but I would put it as low as possible. People with some entrepreneurial experience and, let's say, a tertiary qualification. So that's how I would see South Africa's need for skills. And it's not just the numbers of, this is a thumbsuck invented by an economist I know about 10 years ago as to how many unskilled jobs were sort of vacant in South Africa, and that how many skilled jobs and skilled people South Africa needs. That's where the 800,000 comes from, and some statistical guess. But it must be much higher if the economy starts to go. So it's about 800,000 now, but it will be much higher if we are to get any growth in the next sort of phase. The second is, you made a comment about this will really help firms if we get more skilled people. I wouldn't put it that way. It will help. The universities are desperate for university lecturers, about 800 categories when we looked earlier this year. We have a shortage of medical personnel, of all sorts of people. And our view is that the approach to linking this to existing firms and jobs is the wrong approach. You should open it up much wider. So I'm in favor of opening South Africa's borders to as widely as possible to skilled people, wherever we draw that line. And we are totally opposed to the way in which government has interpreted this in the president's reforms in terms of a critical skills list. We think this is the wrong approach altogether. And I'd be happy to talk about that, Matthew, if we had more time. So let me, time is a factor, let me stop there. A lot of comments. I'm excited that Channing and his colleagues have come out strongly in favor of skilled immigration, but how this is interpreted in policy terms is going to be really important. And that is the fight going on now in the Treasury. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Anne. That's very helpful. Channing, a couple of things for you to mull over and come back on, I think. Wandile?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, for that. And also thanks to Tendai and Channing for the papers. I think both papers are great. So thanks for those insights. And I'll make perhaps maybe 2 points. And the first one, very briefly, it's somewhat a question, maybe it can be regarded that way, to Tendai, because I think that all of the key issues that you've highlighted tonight, we can all agree with in South Africa that we needed to be greening up and moving forward. But where I would like you to perhaps maybe add some insights on, it's around the trade-offs on the jobs and the financing of this story. Some of my colleagues like Kenneth Kramer, I don't know if he's still on the audience, he is beginning to think more about that particular work. So I would like tonight to hear more on that. And the second point I want to speak on is in the area that I spend a bit of time on in agriculture. And I think Channing did some good work in covering that particular point. And my comments there perhaps maybe will be in 2 or 3 folds. And the first one just around the nutrition and food security story in South Africa. Because my sense or my reading of the challenge in South Africa is that we don't really have a food security challenge because of production and all other things, but rather it's that story of jobs, just basically people not having any money to buy, not so much that we're facing rising prices and all of those things. So I guess that links back with some of the questions that you have highlighted of saying, how do we grow and get more people to work so that we can in turn be able to resolve the food security challenge? And in as far as the growth now on building back better, which is in theme with this session, I would in fact not go Channing with the suggestion you were putting forward on the paper about perhaps maybe looking on the smallholder side of agriculture and seeing how that we can advance that into contributing to growth. Because I mean, what we've been observing in South Africa's agriculture up until this moment, I guess it's still in line with what people like Michael Lipton were writing about in 1970s about 2 agricultures in South Africa. Because even the good numbers that we are talking about of the sector having grown, that's largely the commercial big farming sector. If you were to segment those numbers and look at the smallholder farmers, I mean, productivity is still very poor. There's not much growth that is happening in that end. And I think what we should be thinking a lot about is to say, how do we uplift that part of agriculture and perhaps link it in with the major commercial agriculture side? And doing that then will bring us to the very points that Anne was speaking about in terms of saying we don't have much state capacity that can assist in doing that. And I would add there to say also just the political nature of driving some of these things forward. It remains a challenge in South Africa because I think we know what needs to be done in as far as agriculture. We talk a lot about state inefficiencies in state administration. Either those are technical things that are related to livestock and all kinds of nice things that can uplift the rural economy. The infrastructure challenge, I think we have highlighted them in the borders, in the roads and all of that. It's about how do you finance then and bring private sector and government to address all of those things. And security, land needs, and all of those. So I guess for me, those are some of the interventions that will be necessary if agriculture is to uplift some of the potential that is currently underutilized and contribute to this story of building forward and really contributing to our growth narrative. Let me stop there, Matthew, for now. Thanks.
Thanks very much. I think first, let's look at this issue of the trade-offs on jobs and financing. I think that it connects with what I was trying to say in my first observation, that there is this, in practice, quite tangible trade-off in the short term around development and transition. Wandile has identified the issue around trade-offs between jobs and financing. I would like to hear both Tendai and Channing's views on this. Who would like to go first?
Thanks, Matthew. Maybe I can go first. So thanks, Wandile. Thanks to Annie as well, and thanks to Matthew as well. So perhaps the starting point really is to say, at the moment, South Africa faces some kind of an electricity crisis. So we do have some kind of a shortage when it comes to electricity. So one can argue then that it's possible to increase investment into renewables without necessarily cutting or reducing or cutting out coal as a source of energy. Because where we are now, it's possible to significantly invest into renewables without necessarily cutting out coal as a source of energy. But perhaps there are other important ideas as well. For example, other countries are actually beginning to transform. What are the implications for South Africa if it doesn't, right? So perhaps that's another question to ask, to say, if we stick with coal and everybody else around us is transforming, what are the implications when it comes to trade, etc.? Are we, for example, going to continue to produce goods whose demand is declining over time? The consumers are becoming conscious and they are probably going to gradually reduce demanding high carbon content goods. So if we continue producing high carbon goods and we want to export them out there, are we not going to be in trouble there as well? And also perhaps if we don't switch now, are we not going to see those switching costs increasing in future as well? So I think those are some of the issues that we may need to consider as we because really the highest source of these emissions is coming from coal. So we really need to consider moving away from coal. How do we do that without compromising on jobs? Should we just wait, or should we begin to really be aggressive on this, given the dire consequences of not acting now, especially in future?
You're muted, Matthew.
Sorry, it's been a year and a half. I still don't know how to work the technology. Do you want to weigh in on this? Channing?
I can weigh in briefly. I think it's important to point out that there's a lot of research that's been done in a lot of places to show that, South Africa over the long term, and this is exactly what Matthew was talking about, is better off under a pretty heavy renewables mix. You don't need environmental considerations or carbon taxes or anything like that. You just need to use the technologies. You do have to use them well. And Anne's point on capacity, right? Electricity is not a sector where there's no government intervention. It's there everywhere, right? So there's a capacity issue, but that's independent of what system. And you need the state capacity to run coal. You need the state capacity to run renewables. But in the long run, it's pretty convincing that renewables are a cheaper path and could be really quite good relative to the rest of the world. I mean, if you're going to have to power your economy by sun and wind, I'd rather be South Africa than Finland for sure. So this is a real opportunity. The short term, and it's just obviously you all are living it. It's awful. It's really, really hard to get out. And there's been all sorts of issues. I mean, we could talk. And this is 3 seminars for 3 days or whatever on all of those barriers. I did read, coming out of COP26, that there is some international help potentially coming on that transition, and that's wildly welcome, and I think it's a credit to some of the work that's been done in South Africa, looking at having a real sense of what the transition issues are and a real sense of where the economy wants to go in terms of the electricity generation mix. And I think that was really helpful in negotiating this particular agreement. So hopefully with electricity, it'll start to go forward. It is true that broadly, if we're going to have growth, that almost always means some sectors expanding and other sectors contracting. And so we just have to deal with some kind of transition issues. So that's what I would say in those areas, Matthew. Do you want me to go on to the other comments, or how?
And do you want to come in on this before Channing goes on to the other comments?
No, well,
I saw you take a breath at that point.
Yeah, let me make one comment, which let me sort of stir things up.
Please.
There's no doubt in my mind that the issue of nuclear has to be discussed in South Africa as one possibility. I don't know what the job consequences are of X percentage of nuclear, but because of the state of the state and because of corruption, because of the particular composition of the cabinet, it's very problematic to deal with nuclear and Zuma and so on and so forth. So this is an example of one aspect of what I'm talking about, that you have to start policy discussions with a recognition that we're not South Africa of 15 years ago, where we had a serious state, we had a state overwhelmingly committed to the national interest, not perfect, but in all sorts of ways, you could have a serious conversation about that. Now it is extremely difficult. So I just want to say, I think that applies to all policy issues, and that needs to be an underlying theme of the discussion. To Matthew's big question. Sorry, do you want me to stop?
No. I think that's a great segue into the immigration issue where, I think Channing's work, or the Channing and the co-authors' work, indicates very obviously and very clearly the benefits that can be attained through, let's call it skilled immigration, both to GDP growth, but also to non-skilled employment growth or lower skilled employment growth. The instruments for making that possible and managing that in the national interest really seem quite obvious, yet the policy space is completely seized up and sclerotic, to not be too unkind. So yeah, let's segue into that, Channing.
Sure. Yeah, I'm still on. Okay. I think that this is a really good question that Anne, and I'm pleased, that the basic idea is there and accepted. There are, if you look internationally, right, the criteria that I would use, and this was what was done in Denmark, I actually went there on exactly this kind of a program. This is how I, immigrated to Denmark and worked for several years. It's a wage criteria with some exceptions. So basically, if you're a private or an organization in Denmark, this was at the time in '96, and you were paying X or above per month to this person, then that person was considered skilled, and you could hire them. And it was a very, very simple, broad criteria that applied, and so you knew what the rule was, and firms operated on that basis, and it lasted for a certain period of time, and then you had to deal with, okay, people want to stay in it, and so forth. But that, I think, worked very, very well. The exception is what I came in on. I was at the time an academic. Academics don't earn that kind of money. So I think I was earning half the level of what what the line was. But universities, research-intensive universities, were accepted. And so if you had a certain skill qualification, such as a PhD, then you could go and work. The universities didn't have to go through a big long process of getting somebody to come in and work at the university. And you could think of other organizations that you might wish to privilege in that way as well. But certainly the universities in South Africa would be prime candidates, because they're the ones that are meant to get you to your long run solution, which is you're producing enough skilled people yourself. And so this is, you're helping both the economy and the thing. But I agree completely with Anne that yes, the modalities are really important, and how you do that is absolutely crucial to the effectiveness of the policy. And it's possible, we've done it in the models, that you can come up with convoluted policies that then become counterproductive, that you sort of just move things around a little bit, and you don't get the benefits that we spoke about. The benefits that we're speaking about here are driven from a fairly flexible policy that allows the sectors that need the skilled labor, highly skilled labor, to come in. So highly skilled here, formally, Anne, is being defined as earning triple the average wage for tertiary educated labor, right, on the economy-wide basis. That's what we used formally in that. You can argue about it, but it changing that actually essentially just changes the number of people that you need. So if you make it lower, you would need more people. You're just sort of assuming what it is that these people earn and produce as they come in, right? So that's all that's going on there. So that's on the one point. May I go on to Wandili's point, because I think it's really important.
Sure.
Wandili, I agree with you completely, and I'd really like to talk with you a little bit more. My impression is that we can't just wish away land reform. That's not possible, right? That you need to come to grips with land reform. There's a bunch of other things that South Africa really also needs to come to grips with. One is, your diets are terrible, especially for women, right? Your obesity rates are really rising, right? And this really points to fresh fruits, vegetables, a healthier diet that's more accessible to people. I think you can combine these two things together, right? That if you go, what is it, and this is where Michael Lipton has a point, right? If a small farmer is going to have an advantage, it's going to be in the time and attention that farmer can deliver to the land that's that he or she is farming, and typically it's relatively near to them. So that means you want relatively high value stuff on that land. That's fruits and vegetables, right? So now you've got to work around that basic reality. You want to clump them up together because they also, and this is where he also agrees, and he has a point, it's correct, so there's high transaction costs, right? They have transaction costs on the input purchase side, they have transaction costs because they're small on the output purchase side. So kind of clumping them together, producing these higher value crops, especially the fruits and vegetables, getting them to your communities to improve diets. This is a win. It may not be the world's greatest winner, but you're already doing a whole bunch of things around this. The thing that's killing your commercial sector is the wild uncertainty that's around land reform, or at least it was. And who's going to invest to drive this sector forward? So I think that the short-term thing that can unleash this commercial sector and also help with other issues is trying to go after getting that uncertainty to go away, and it's not going to happen by saying, oh, let's not do land reform, uncertainty's all gone. No, we need a credible program that's going to hopefully work for a while, that then leaves certain parts to be invested in, and this is what's going to go forward, and this is what's going to change. I will add one deal, and I think that you guys need to think about this quite a lot. Obviously we're headed towards things that use water, right? Once you go to fruits and vegetables, right? So all of a sudden it's not land reform anymore, it's water reform, right? That's the big deal, right? And once you start taking away water from high value goods, then your potential to do harm, your potential to do good goes up, your potential to harm goes up as well. So you have to be quite careful about the whole thing, and I think it goes back to Anne's point on state capacity and so forth. but those would be that's the idea here. It's not let's have a smallholder based agriculture for everything. I mean, obviously that's just not going to work. But for certain things, it's the way to go. And there are realities in South Africa that have to come to grips with and in the policy space. Right?
Thanks, Channing. Some excitement coming together, which is great. And I see the hand. Before I ask you, Channing, there's a quite technical question that hopefully can be dealt with quite quickly from Andrea Messiah, which I think links to Jason Davis's question. He asks, can we flip around the elasticities in the CGE model showing the effect of skilled immigration shock? In other words, if it were a skilled emigration shock, can we just reverse the signs, or more or less? And Jason Davis asks, although it's also, I suppose, more of a comment, a bit of a comment, what about the brain drain? Professionals are leaving across the spectrum. And of course, Rob Davies makes a similar comment a little bit further down. So if you wouldn't mind just talking about that issue of Andrea Messiah's, and then how very quickly, how you locate the brain drain or the demand for skilled South African labor that is emerging internationally. We then hand over Anne, and hopefully Wandile wants to come in on some of your observations about the agricultural sector.
Okay, so the short answer on the technical question is yes, more or less. As a first cut, you just reverse the signs in a way, the capital is going to be installed. So, there's technicalities here. We would not assume that existing capital would go away. Whereas in the positive side, we assume that new capital can be brought in. So, but yeah, I mean, obviously, if skilled immigration is on net happening in a substantial way, then that's a pretty good explanation for why the wages of skilled workers are going up, and partly why the growth is so slow. So it's an issue, and you don't want it. I'd be keen to see. I don't know how great the stats are on this. I think they're quite bad. That South Africans leave to go out and work abroad is actually quite okay. What you want them to do is come back. I think they do. I mean, there are attractions to living in London, but then people do get tired of living in a rainy climate and tiny apartment in a city for a long time in South Africa. So people do come back too. I think it's attractive. That there's no reason why you couldn't hold on to more people and bring in more. So that's that. Matthew, was there something else you wanted me to address there?
No, let's move it over to Anne.
Great, thanks very much. I want to address one or two of the questions and then ask Channing something. So the way I see this is there's a global war for talent, or you can say there's a global market for talent. And South African ministers and politicians and individuals often bemoan the fact that they say, oh, our nurses are being poached, or now we're losing people. We've been losing skilled people for a long time. And you're right, Channing, the numbers are terrible. We don't actually know what is going on. But my view would be that developing countries have to think about this as, in a sense, an industry. And there's nothing to say, for example, we do it with pilots. We're training pilots, or we used to, for the global market. And we should say there are opportunities. If we can train nurses in South Africa more cheaply and at global sort of standards, great, let's do that. We can export people, they can send remittances back, and you can get, so we've got to think about this issue differently rather than, oh, the horrible world is taking our skills. So that's one point. This is, we know that skills are in short supply, and with all sorts of things going on in Europe, population decline, COVID, this and the next thing. There's increased demand for all sorts of skills, and South Africa should think about this. Obviously, we should fix all sorts of things so that people don't want to leave. But so there are a set of complex policy issues, but we should be thinking about a global market for skills and how South Africa participates in that global market rather than we're a victim. That's my first point. The second would be, I'm intrigued from, if I understood you correctly, that your model looked at, I think you said, people earning 3 times the average sort of academic. Is that right? Well, anyhow, it sounded like an incredibly high figure. I think for a developing country, that Denmark isn't a good example, and that we need to be thinking very differently about this. And if your model could try and map out some of the implications for a much wider open door to skilled migrants, a much wider definition of skills. We don't just need, university lecturers, doctors, specialists. We need artisans. We need all sorts of people. And partly we need them to grow the economy now, but partly we need them to help train South Africans. And it goes quite way below university people, but we also need entrepreneurs. So I think there are a lot of issues in this whole debate. And it's great that if you could do more academic work on this, that would be great, in my view. I want to raise another question about your paper, which I found really interesting. I'm pleased that you did start looking at the urban spatial issue. And your paper, after all, says here are 3 policy things that could be done now, cheaply and quickly. So I agree 500% on focusing on the cities and growth. I think one's got to go further and deeper than you guys did. I agree with you about what you said. I think one's got to think differently about who's building our cities and what the South African housing policy should be. And we've issued a document last year on what's happening in our metros. I don't know about other cities, but we're starting to see small Black developers, mainly small Black developers, creating backyard accommodation, turning single family houses into multiple accommodation, which is affordable for people with very little money and is much better than being far away and having to pay tons and tons of money to transport and so on. So if, our slogan was much better to rent in Orange Grove in Johannesburg than own in Orange Farm. And there are a whole lot of consequences that come out of that. If you can we need to densify the cities, and people are doing this, and we need to support this. So I think there's a lot to talk about in terms of urban development, urban policy, and a lot of which is happening, and the country can't afford our current housing policy, and we should be debating how we use that much more effectively to support this wave of building affordable, accessible, and much better located accommodation for people. Thanks, Matthew.
Pleasure, and thank you very much. We are starting to run out of time. I do want to close with a question to each of you when we get there. The question is going to be, very quickly, what is the most important policy failure? Where are we letting ourselves down the most from your perspective? And secondly, what is the most important research question, or the thing that if you could see some research on in this space, what is it? What do you think it should be? I want to hand over to Wandile. Channing had made some quite interesting and I think useful comments about the agricultural sector. In particular, Wandile, I would be very interested in hearing the experience with organizing small-scale agricultural production for commercial mean ends. So if you got any thoughts on what Channing was saying, that'd be great to hear them.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and also thanks, Channing, for those comments. I think, I mean, if I were to start on the point that you are raising, and I think it alludes also, as you rightly say, to Channing's point, there's been some success examples where smallholder farmers have come together, aggregate their produce, and over time progress. I mean, in South Africa, if you think of, I don't know how many people might be familiar with this, Miss Gloria Serobe, for example, in Wippold in the Eastern Cape. Those are some of the people that on the ground, they've began, it's agribusiness led by Black women. And right now, if you look at their numbers and you look at where they are in terms of progress, they are competing in the usual markets like anybody else. And the volumes coming out of there and just the upliftment of those communities out of the money generated in that agricultural, those agricultural farms have been great over time. But I do think, though, to kick the ball forward, I mean, for South Africa, for me, in your questions of research of saying, what are some of the things folks should be thinking about? And I guess this is not only for us in the panel, but even folks joining online. I would like to hear more about how do we improve and get our state capacity to be more agile? Because, I mean, in the papers and many things that are being written up, you do see the ideas coming up very much clearly, but the problem comes in on the implementation side. I don't know if it's only just the political climate of there or there's something else in our machinery that needs to be done. I think there's a lot of work that could be done there. And let me close off on the land reform space, because I think there is a number of things that could be done in two ways. And one of it could also be in support of the points that Anne was raising, because over time in South Africa, we have agriculturalized land reform. But I think for the urban areas and the housing, there's a lot that can be done in there. And I think in the near term, I mean, if South African government is sitting with roughly 9 million hectares of land in its books at this point, if you could begin releasing that with those tradable title deeds or land rights or whatever form, I think that could begin to change the game even before you move into broader policies of saying going forward, how should we be thinking about land reform? And in thinking about it going forward, I think that idea of a land reform agency, which even in the SONA of this year came up from the presidency, that could be useful. And the reason I'm raising the agency, I'm raising it in understanding that the failures that we're having now are not only because land reform is ambiguous, but rather the state capacity in delivering it has also been a constraint. And I think if you could have that on a PPP approaches on land reform, it could begin to do some interesting work. Let me stop there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Wandile. And your comment about kind of the state capacity is interesting. You know, everything I've chaired until now for URSA usually ends up with me banging on about structural reform. And what's interesting about these papers is that they're, you know, structural reform is terribly important, but what is really also very present is policy failure, which in a sense is a lower hanging fruit. It's about drafting and implementing a different set of strategies within government. Channing, over to you.
Okay, quickly, a few points just to you know, and what the level might be. First, you know, we're just looking at people who have some kind of post-secondary degree. It doesn't have to be a university degree. So, and that's considered tertiary by Stats SA. So the average wage at tertiary is not as high as you might think. So 3 times tertiary is not as high as you might think. Why did we go to 3 times? Is because you know, obviously this is politically difficult to get through. And once you go up to that level, you know, there's certain groups in South Africa that have done really, really well for a long time now. And now we're going to expose those people to international competition first. And I think that's the most justifiable thing as you wade into a policy of more engagement, which I agree with, on these international sort of labor markets, right? So that's the rationale there. So we can get you the number. I don't know it right off the top of my head, what it would roughly be yet. On the policy, broadly, there needs to be more of an export orientation, looking abroad. I think the government, we can't. Right now, we don't have there's not a lot of physical space. Where's the demand going to come from? You have to latch onto international sources of demand in order to move the growth process at this point. And that focus just isn't there. I've been in growth for 2 hours, and I'm the only one that mentions exports in the whole thing. I mean, that just doesn't happen in India, for example. That would never happen. And so, it's got that's something that's a policy orientation, I think, that needs to be, and you should be confident. I think there's an underconfidence here that's kind of toxic. Certainly, South Africa can compete. We know it. Doing it in lots of places. So it's just a matter of reinforcing that. In terms of the research, I think it's along those lines as well. And if you look at the history, a lot of the gains, I think some of these wages is with South Africa's engagement with the rest of Africa. And this is still a really, really big, it's not the only opportunity, obviously, but I mean, South Africa is extremely well positioned to engage in what is which should be a rapidly growing economy that's doing whole sub-Saharan African economy that with a lot of skills and things to deliver, and working more closely and having it be a two-way street, right? Such that you can't just endlessly ship manufactured, food processed goods up to Zambia and not buy anything from Zambia. It's not going to work. So you got to have trade as a two-way street in this process, and more on that shows the benefits, I think, in energy, in food, in the highly skilled areas that we've been talking about. I think the opportunities are just huge. So those would be the places that I would go.
Thank you, Channing. Yeah, as part of the series, we had a very interesting paper by Matthew Stern, or from Matthew Stern and a co-author, on describing trade policy. I remember coming into economics in the late 90s, early 2000s. Everybody was interested in trade policy. It was the sexy conversation. If such a thing is possible for economics, it was the attractive topic. And it's extraordinary to me that it's just something that nobody looks at or thinks about. An interesting comment that there's a kind of self-confidence issue around it. Tendai, where are we letting ourselves down, and what is it that we should be researching?
Thanks, Matthew. So for me, I think when it comes to the issues on research, I think perhaps the trade-off, I think has been, there have been a number of questions around this trade-off between say green industrialization and some macro outcomes like your unemployment, your economic growth, etc. Perhaps Channing and others who are into CGE modeling may want to further unpack that so that we really better understand the short-term, long-term effects of green industrialization on some of these outcomes. Another possible area really perhaps relevant to what Channing was talking about is really as much to do with the African continental free trade area as African countries rebuild post-COVID. What exactly could be, how do they take into account the free trade area that was recently established? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Tendai. We are experiencing a brain drain as we approach 4:30. Anne?
Yes, I'm part of that brain drain at 4:30, exactly. So my answer is, well, two things. The one is I agree with Channing about the importance of exports, and I'm currently involved in a little battle about localization on exactly this topic. So it's a bit sensitive. to my mind, the most important policy failure in the country at the moment is a very difficult one. It's a failure to recognize how weak and corrupt and unable to do almost anything the state is. And until you do that, which is extremely difficult, I know, we aren't going to make progress. So we keep relying on the state as though it really exists, when actually it's primarily a bunch of thieving sort of looters and incompetence. And you can imagine if you're not one of those and you work in government, I'd hide under my desk, which is, I think, what a lot of people do. You don't know who's a crook or whose agenda you're on to implement whatever. So that is the key policy failure. And until we say that's the reality, now what do? We set up a separate agency if we can, as Gwatidzo suggested, and others in the rural areas, or whatever. But, you know, to think that a failing state can be at the heart of an economic recovery strategy is a fundamental error from day one. And that's where we are now. I'm going to leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. That is indeed an extremely sobering point for us to end. It reminds me of an interview I heard a couple of years ago with the previous minister of the DPSA, where Anne Josephs on 702 was saying to him, you know, so many civil servants are corrupt. And he said, you know, you got to keep in mind that there are many, many civil servants that work hard and in the interests of the people. There are many of them, maybe even more than 50%. And I thought to myself, come on, are we aiming so low? Anyway, difficult issue to accept, but also a difficult one to confront. Thank you very much, Anna. I understand you have to go. To everybody else, thank you very much for your attention. To the speakers, thank you very much for giving us your time and an opportunity to engage and discuss these issues with you. All of this is being recorded, will be posted on the URSA website and YouTube channel, and the written documents, I think, across this series are a particularly useful resource available both on the URSA website and IFWI's website. So with that, at exactly 4:30, thank you very much for your attention and have a good day.